At 10:00 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on February 17, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in front of a packed room in Ottawa and unveiled something NATO allies weren't expecting: Canada's first ever defense industrial strategy, a $6.6 billion plan to shift military procurement away from American suppliers and build a domestic defense ecosystem from scratch. The strategy includes $180 billion committed to domestic procurement, $290 billion for infrastructure, and a promise to create 125,000 jobs over the next decade. But here's the part that caught Washington completely off guard. Carney announced that Canada will meet NATO's new 5% GDP defense spending target by 2035 without relying on American contractors. That's a direct challenge to decades of integrated North American defense supply chains. For 77 years, Canada and the United States have been the closest military allies on the planet. They share intelligence. They share air defense through NORAD. They share weapon systems. But Trump's repeated threats to annex Canada, his public jokes about making Canadian provinces the 51st state, and his tariff ultimatums pushed Carney to do something unprecedented. Canada is decoupling its defense industry from the United States in the middle of a NATO buildup. This is not a symbolic gesture. This is not diplomatic theater. This is Canada fundamentally realigning its security strategy, and the implications for US-Canada relations, for NATO cohesion, and for North American defense integration are staggering. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through exactly what Canada's defense industrial strategy contains and why it shocked NATO allies. I'm going to reveal how Trump's rhetoric directly triggered this strategic shift. I'm going to show you the reactions from Washington, from European NATO members, and from the Pentagon. I'm going to explain why this puts the United States in an impossible position where defending itself makes the situation worse. And I'm going to give you 3 scenarios for where North American security goes from here, including the nightmare scenario where NORAD dissolves and Canada aligns militarily with Europe instead of America. Subscribe to join the community. Leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going, and share this video if it brought you value. Let me explain what Canada's defense industrial strategy actually is, because most Canadians didn't even know their country lacked one until last week. For decades, Canada relied on American defense contractors for everything from fighter jets to naval vessels to ammunition. Canadian military procurement was essentially an extension of the Pentagon's supply chain. That arrangement made sense when the United States was a reliable partner, but Trump's threats changed the calculation. Here's what the strategy includes. First, $379.2 million for the Regional Defense Investment Initiative, which will fund Canadian small and medium-sized defense contractors to develop domestic capabilities. Second, a requirement that 60% of all new military contracts must go to Canadian companies by 2030. Third, $180 billion committed to domestic procurement over the next decade. Fourth, $290 billion allocated for defense infrastructure, including bases, shipyards, and production facilities. Carney didn't just announce spending. He announced a philosophy. He called it strategic autonomy, the idea that Canada cannot depend on a single ally for its security, no matter how close that ally has been historically. And he named the threat explicitly. He said Trump's rhetoric about annexing Canada forced Ottawa to rethink every assumption about North American defense. That's a sitting Canadian Prime Minister publicly stating that the United States is now a security concern, not just a security partner. The shift is seismic. Here's why Washington was caught off guard. The Trump administration assumed Canada would panic under tariff pressure and beg for relief. They assumed Carney would cave to economic threats and agree to Trump's demands on trade, on energy, on border policy. They did not expect Canada to respond by pulling out of integrated defense supply chains and building parallel systems that exclude American contractors. The Pentagon released a statement within hours expressing concern. The statement said, "The Department of Defense values its partnership with Canada. We are reviewing the implications of Canada's new procurement strategy for joint defense programs and NORAD operations." That's diplomatic language for "we're worried this breaks our ability to operate together." Republican senators were blunt. Senator Lindsey Graham said Canada is making a huge mistake. They're weakening North American security to make a political point against the president. This helps China and Russia, not Canada. Senator Marco Rubio said, "Canada's new defense plan is a gift to our adversaries. It fractures NATO from within." But here's what those senators don't understand. Canada didn't fracture NATO. Trump did. When the President of the United States publicly threatens to annex an allied country, when he jokes about Canadian provinces becoming American states, when he imposes tariffs as leverage to extract political concessions, he signals that the alliance is conditional. Canada is simply acting on that signal. Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you is the evidence that European NATO members are quietly supporting Canada's move and that the United States is becoming isolated within its own alliance. Receipt number 1, the UK position. British Defence Secretary John Healey gave a statement saying, "The United Kingdom respects Canada's decision to strengthen its domestic defence industrial base. All NATO members have the right to pursue strategic autonomy." That's Britain publicly backing Canada's decision to reduce dependence on American contractors. Receipt number 2, the European response. France, Germany, and the Netherlands issued a joint statement saying, "We welcome Canada's commitment to meeting NATO spending targets and support efforts by all allies to develop resilient defense industries." That's 3 major European powers endorsing Canada's decoupling from the US. Receipt number 3, the Polish calculation. Poland and the Baltic states depend on American military presence to deter Russia, so they're reluctant to openly criticize Washington. But privately, according to diplomatic sources, they're telling other NATO members that if the United States can threaten Canada's sovereignty, American security guarantees to Eastern Europe suddenly feel less reliable. Receipt number 4, the defense industry reaction. American contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and General Dynamics have Canadian subsidiaries that generate billions in revenue. Those contracts are now at risk. Lockheed Martin's CEO issued a statement saying, "We are disappointed by Canada's shift away from integrated defense procurement. This decision will increase costs and reduce interoperability." Wall Street heard that, and defense stocks dropped immediately. Here's why this puts the United States in an impossible position. If the US retaliates against Canada's defense strategy with more tariffs or economic pressure, it proves Canada's point that the US is not a reliable partner. That drives Canada closer to Europe and accelerates the decoupling process. If the US tries to block Canada's strategy by threatening to withdraw from NORAD or other joint defense agreements, it proves that American commitments are conditional and transactional. That undermines US credibility across the entire NATO alliance. If the US does nothing and allows Canada to proceed, it accepts a permanent reduction in North American defense integration. Canada will build its own fighter jets, its own naval vessels, its own weapons systems. Over time, Canada becomes less dependent on American capabilities and more aligned with European defense structures. There is no good option for Washington. Every response makes the situation worse. Here's what happened in the days after Carney's announcement. Trump issued a Truth Social post at 11:37 p.m. saying, "Canada is making a big mistake. They want to waste billions on their own defense companies instead of buying the best from America. When they fail, don't come crying to us for help. Maybe they should just join the USA and save everyone the trouble." That response was immediately criticized by NATO diplomats as tone-deaf and counterproductive. By mocking Canada's strategy, Trump reinforced Carney's argument that the U.S. cannot be trusted. By suggesting Canada should join the U.S., Trump validated Canadian fears about American intentions. At 9:15 a.m. the next morning, the Pentagon issued its own statement that was notably different in tone from Trump's post. The Pentagon said, "The Department of Defense is committed to North American defense and to the NATO alliance. We will work constructively with Canada to ensure that joint defense programs continue to function effectively." That's the Pentagon directly contradicting Trump. The military understands that Canada's concerns about sovereignty and reliability are serious, and that dismissing them threatens U.S. national security. The split between the Pentagon and Trump tells you that even within the U.S. government, there's no consensus on how to handle this. Congressional reaction has been divided. 12 Republican senators who have been quietly distancing themselves from Trump's Canada policy released a joint statement saying, "We support Canada's right to develop its domestic defense industry. Canada is a vital ally and deserves to be treated with respect." Democratic leaders went further. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said, "Canada's defense strategy is a direct result of the president's reckless rhetoric. This administration has damaged our most important alliance and undermined our national security. The president should apologize to Canada." Here's what Canada is actually trying to achieve with this move, and it's more strategic than it might appear. Canada knows that building a domestic defense industry from scratch will take years and cost more than simply buying American. That's not the point. The point is to create leverage. By demonstrating that Canada is willing to absorb short-term costs to reduce long-term dependence on the US, Carney is signaling that Trump's threats have no power. Canada is also preparing for a post-Trump future. If Trump loses the 2026 midterms or the 2028 election, Canada wants a paper trail showing that it stood up for sovereignty while the US under Trump violated alliance principles. That makes it easier for future US administrations to repair the relationship by distancing themselves from Trump's actions. Let me give you 3 scenarios for where this goes. Scenario 1, the alliance pressure forces a US retreat. Over the next 6 months, European NATO members continue to publicly support Canada's strategy. The political pressure becomes overwhelming. Trump, facing isolation within NATO and rebellion from Senate Republicans, agrees to issue a statement saying he never intended to question Canada's sovereignty. Carney accepts the statement as sufficient. Canada continues its defense industrial buildup, but reopens cooperation with American contractors on select programs. The crisis de-escalates, but U.S. credibility within NATO is permanently damaged. Scenario 2, the alliance splits. Trump doubles down on his rhetoric. He imposes new tariffs on Canadian defense exports. He threatens to withdraw from NORAD. Canada responds by accelerating its strategic realignment toward Europe. European NATO members offer Canada increased defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, and security guarantees that are explicitly separate from U.S. arrangements. Over time, Canada becomes more of a European-aligned NATO member than a North American one. The alliance becomes paralyzed by internal division. Russia and China exploit the division to advance their interests, knowing the West can no longer coordinate effectively. Scenario 3, the Canadian realignment. Canada's defense industrial strategy succeeds beyond expectations. Canadian contractors develop competitive alternatives to American weapons systems. Canada signs joint defense production agreements with France, Germany, and the UK. Over the next decade, Canada builds a fully independent military capability that reduces dependence on the U.S. to near zero. The U.S. loses its most important geographic ally and faces a strategic environment where its northern border is no longer reliably friendly. This scenario takes years to fully materialize, but it begins with this announcement. I'm watching whether Trump moderates his rhetoric on Canada's sovereignty, whether additional NATO members issue statements supporting Canada's strategy, and whether the Pentagon and the White House can develop a unified response. Canada just announced that it's reducing dependence on the United States for its national defense. That sentence should be impossible. The US and Canada have been the closest of allies for over a century, but it's happening. And how Washington responds will determine whether the alliance survives this crisis intact or whether we're watching the beginning of the end of North American security integration. Do you think Carney is right to pursue strategic autonomy, or is Canada overreacting to Trump's rhetoric? Drop your take below. I read every single one. And subscribe right now if you want the next update on this crisis before the mainstream headlines even catch up to what's really happening. History is moving fast. The board is flipping. Make sure you're watching.